Welcome back to Sawbones Barbecue. I'm your host, Old Sawbones. With me on the camera, as always, is FT. And I'm excited to announce that we have a new member of the Sawbones Barbecue team to introduce, but he is currently taking a nap, which is hard work, so he'll be with us later. Today we're gonna do a really nice cook, which is picanha. This is a cut of meat that's kind of confusing to people because it's known by different names. Sometimes you'll see it sold as coulotte steak. Sometimes you'll hear it called a sirloin cap or even a rump cap. And then the other name for it is picanha, which you'll hear in the context of like a Brazilian barbecue, a churrascaria. So it's all the same cut of meat. It's a sirloin cap. It comes in a whole chunk like this, which is triangular in shape. One side has a big fat cap on it. The other side, you can see the grain of the meat. And aside from having different names, there's also several very different ways to prepare it. You can cook it as a roast and cook it very much like you would cook a tri-tip, and there's nothing wrong with that. It works great. You can cut it into 3 big chunks and put them on a skewer and cook it on a rotisserie. That's how they do it at a churrascaria. Or you can cut it into steaks and cook them the same way you would cook any other steak with a reverse sear or that kind of technique. So that's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna take this very nice cut, we're gonna turn it into 3 or 4 steaks, and then we're gonna cook those. So the main thing we're gonna go over today is the meat and how to handle the meat to get it prepped to cook as steaks. This particular one comes from Snake River Farms, which as ever is my favorite source for beef these days. It's about 85, 90 bucks, something like that, so it's not cheap, although you get a little over 4 pounds. This one was 4.1 pounds, so I don't know, do the math, something like 22 bucks a pound. It's not what I would call cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than some of their pre-trimmed, really nice steaks, and in my opinion, it's equally delicious. So if you have enough eaters to put away a 4-pound cut, it's a very good value. If you're gonna do it on a rotisserie, like Brazilian barbecue style, your first cuts need to be against the grain, because when you cut it to serve, you'll be cutting in that same direction because it's folded up that way on the skewer. However, if you're gonna serve it as steaks, your first cuts need to be with the grain, because the last cut before it goes on the plate is then across the grain. So that's a very important thing to get straight. Okay, so we're gonna get ready to cut this into steaks. This is the fat cap side, obviously. You can do, a little bit of trimming if there's any little extra bits, kind of square it up a little bit. And then we're gonna look at the grain side and figure out the correct way to orient it for cutting. So if we look at this side, you can see the grain is running this direction. And there's some little bits on the end that need to be trimmed, and then a little bit of this kind of silverskin membrane that needs to come off. I like to use decent tools. So these are surgical pickups. These are called Ferris Smiths. You can get these on Amazon for about 20 bucks. Very good investment in my opinion. And then for trimming this membrane, sometimes I'll use a weck blade. This is basically just a flat scalpel that's used in burn surgery sometimes. You can get these disposable razor blades for about $1.25 a piece. And then you don't have to worry about knife sharpening. You have a perfectly sharp blade every time you want to trim something. So a few dollars well spent, and you can kind of up your trimming game a little bit. So I like to use these. You don't have to trim it, meticulously, but you just want to get some of this membrane stuff off that's a little bit nasty. So kind of as soon as you see the fibers of the meat, you don't want to go any deeper than that. You want to shear just enough to take the little membrane bits off and not waste too much meat. So we're just about done getting the last of this little membrane off, and then we're ready to cut it into steaks. Again, when you're serving it as steaks, it's very important to cut with the grain, and a good thickness for this is about 1.25 inches. So what I'll do is get it oriented the way the fibers go so I can get my cuts how I want them. And then what I do is use a brisket slicer to size up the steaks. First we'll trim a little bit off of this edge just so it comes out nice and flat in terms of the steak. And this is not going to go to waste. We'll make a little snack out of this. You could save it for hamburgers, or you could fry it up in a pan, but definitely not going to go to waste. I'm just taking this edge off so I could get a nice flat edge for my steak. So I'll set that aside for snacking. And now we're going to cut this into 1.25 inch slabs. So I'll use the brisket slicer to judge what 1.25 inches it is. I basically just lay it on the steak. I happen to know the thickness is 1.25 inches, flip it up, and then I should be able to make nice perfect thickness steaks. So again, I'll just lay the blade on it, figure out my 1.25 inches approximately, cut the second steak. And they get progressively smaller as you go, and that's normal. So they start off being 8 to 10 ounces and they end up being maybe 6 ounces by the time you get to the far side. Yeah, I think that's worth putting on the grill. So we got 5 steaks out of this one. This last one's maybe a kind of a 4 to 6 ounce or a little bit small. So we're done cutting it up into steaks. We got some nice little scraps to set aside. We can make a little snack plate out of those. And then in terms of the steaks, the seasoning is really simple. It consists of salt.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
And that's it. And the other thing worth considering is how much of a fat cap you want on them. It's at least 1/2 inch thick, which I think is a little bit much. So I usually will come through with either a fillet knife like this or with the scalpel and just kind of trim that fat cap down to about 1/4 inch. So I'll do that first before I put the salt brine on there. And we'll just come through and cut these all down to about 1/4 inch. I usually cut halfway through from one side and then flip them over and come through from the other side so I can get the thickness correct. Okay, so we've got our steaks cut to 1.25 inch thickness, and we've got the fat cap trimmed to about 1/4 inch. So there's still a nice fat cap on there, as you can see, but it's not kind of excessive. Now the next key is to get a generous coating of salt. We're using Jacobsen sea salt, and you put a generous amount on there. Some of it's gonna flake off when it's on the smoker, and that's okay. But I find it needs about 45 minutes to an hour of salt, and coincidentally, that's about how much time it needs on the smoker to hit our intermediate temperature of 120, 125. So in the interest of time, I like to get them salted and then just gently place them on the smoker, and they can kind of brine and smoke at the same time. And then the last phase will be the searing. So it's kind of hard to get too much on here because a lot of it's going to kind of flake off when you want a fair bit to absorb in there. So I salt them quite generously with this flaky sea salt. All right, so we're just about done with the salting. I'm gonna throw some temperature probes in these and smoke them at about 250 degrees for 45 minutes to an hour, or basically until the internal temperature is 120 to 125. This way they can kind of brine in the salt at the same time they're smoking, because I'm impatient and I want to eat this deliciousness. All right, we're back. We've smoked the steaks for about 45 minutes, so they got a nice red color on them, and we've still got our little salt crust on there. And now we're ready for the final phase, which is giving them a sear. So we've got our grill grates preheated, and they got a little over hot, so I'm just giving them a minute. Right in the middle there, we're at 695. So I'll work the steaks around the edge a little bit, and I won't put one right on the hot spot. 695 is a little bit much. I like to get about maybe 600. So we'll kind of work around the edges a little bit. All right, so these have gone about 4 minutes total, 2 minutes on each side, and kind of flipping them around to even them out a little bit. They've got a real nice color and some nice grill marks on them. And we are almost done. Just checking the temperature on the last couple of them. I think we're right about where we need to be. So we'll start pulling these bad boys off. So these are all getting pulled around the high 120s, and by the time they're done resting, they'll be in the mid to high 130s, which will be a nice medium rare. The steaks have been seared, they've been rested for about 10 minutes, and we're ready to cut into them and see how we did. Now this is where the across the grain part comes in, because we cut them with the grain before. When we get them cut for serving, we're now going across the grain. And this is the only part we care about in terms of the grain of the steak. I'm gonna have to have a taste for judgment purposes. That's perfect. Very tender, very juicy, and just the right amount of salt on it. Even though I left the salt brine on there, it doesn't end up being excessive. By the time the steaks get transferred on and off the smoker and flipped a few times searing, a lot of that salt crust is kind of falling off. So the amount that's left at the end of the day is just right. So I'm real happy with how these came out. And I think we need to take a break and eat these bad boys.
But wait, there's more.
I almost forgot in my haste to cut up and eat that delicious steak to introduce our newest member of the team. This is Charlie. He's 8 weeks old. He's a cool dude. Charlie is going to be our official taster, but for now he's a mascot because he's not old enough to eat steak yet. Aren't you, Charlie? But he aspires to be our official meat taster, and it's probably kind of cruel and unusual for me to hold him over the steak and not let him have any. So Charlie will be back for future appearances, won't you, buddy? Yes. Thanks for watching. Click the subscribe button and stay tuned for more great Sawbones videos.